Secretary of State Marco Rubio will meet with G7 foreign ministers in France for talks on Russia's war in Ukraine and the Middle East situation stemming from the U.S. Israel war in Iran. Deutsche Welle correspondent Arthur Sullivan joins us now from Berlin. Arthur, g'day. So the US has been calling for European countries to get involved in the war in Iran. Will Marco Rubio use this meeting as an opportunity to pursue that point?
Yeah, well, this meeting will bring him face to face with three of those governments, leading representatives of those governments, so France, the UK and Germany. And as you said, all three have been pressured by the US President Donald Trump to varying degrees. I think the UK has probably gotten it worse than the other two, but to varying degrees, all three have been pressed to get involved in the war in Iran. And despite the continuing threats and indeed insults around that, all three have been quite steadfast in their refusals to provide direct military support. So the question really is, as you've asked, will Rubio, at the behest of his boss, US President Donald Trump, continue to press them? So far, the early indications are that he probably will. At least he'll scold them for what the Trump administration has criticised as their unwillingness and their apparent cowardliness to get involved in America's fight. Before he left for Europe, Rubio echoed some of Trump's own sentiments on that topic. And this war in Iran has really provided a serious quandary for these European governments, because they're eager to maintain transatlantic ties, but they're also obviously eager to avoid a conflict, certainly with a country like Iran, not least because of the volatility of the region, but also because of the stakes in terms of energy markets, possible refugee movements. And to this point, Joe, France, Germany and the UK have really shown very little sign of deviating from their previous positions. And this week, Germany's defence minister again reiterated that while Germany, for example, is willing to support peace efforts in Iran, or indeed support navigation, freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz once peace has been secured, he also said there's no strategy from the US, no clear objective. So the strong words against this war remain the case from those European allies.
Yeah, Australia has sent surveillance aircraft and also ballistic missiles to the Gulf states. Have European countries played any kind of role so far?
Well, this is the really interesting thing. So while those European NATO members have strongly resisted direct involvement, for example, like that Australian example, or sending ships, they are quietly playing a role and have been very much facilitating the US military operation here, as they always do, really, because what we've seen over the past few weeks, US bombers, drones, ships have been refueling and arming across bases in Europe. So in the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Greece, several other countries. So they're very clear examples of the fact that these countries are all military allies with the US. I mean, for example, here in Germany, the biggest US base in Europe is in Ramstein Air Base. And it's a key nerve centre for this entire operation in Iran, for drones. I mean, US bombers have also been flying in and out of a UK base. And in Greece, the Gerald Ford, that's the world's largest aircraft carrier, that's been undergoing repairs after damage in a fire. And sometimes it's easy to miss this when you hear the rhetoric from Donald Trump, but when you actually hear what military commanders are saying, so NATO's top military commander, the US Air Force General Grinkovich, he said recently in Senate testimony that European allies have been, quote, extremely supportive when it comes to the war in Iran. So that's obviously a very different tune than the one we're hearing from Donald Trump.
And so all in all, how has the war in Iran impacted US-Europe relations, given they've already been tested in 2026?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to overstate just how much the Greenland affair earlier this year, so that was when Trump was openly threatening to use military force to take over the European territory there, that really damaged the already frayed ties between Europe and the US, because Europe took those threats very seriously, and indeed they still take them seriously. I don't think anyone thinks that's completely off the table. We found out recently, for example, that at the height of that crisis, Denmark went as far as to send explosives and blood supplies to Greenland in preparation for a possible US attack, as absurd as that sounds. They even made contingency plans to blow up the main runways for planes on the territory. So that was the context in which the relations between the US and Europe were when this war in Iran broke out. And yet again, with this war in Iran, Trump has shown unpredictability to European allies, threatening to damage NATO, threatening to withdraw support, despite the fact that he didn't consult them about their plans. He's called them cowards. He's continued to insult them and obviously prompted rebukes in return. And yet, at the same time, all the while as this is happening, we've been seeing consistent efforts by NATO's leader, the Secretary General Mark Rutte, to keep Trump on side no matter what. And actually yesterday, Joe, he presented NATO's annual report and in Brussels, and at the event he absolutely lavished praise on Trump. And that irritated some of those European leaders, not least because he also outlined very clear support for the war in Iran, and even went as far as to suggest that European allies would eventually, quote, come together to deploy their naval assets in the Strait of Hormuz. But given the unpredictability we've already addressed when it comes to Trump, Rutte looks like an increasingly lone voice in those US-European relations.
OK, Arthur Sullivan there in Berlin. And I'll just clarify there, I said Australia had sent that surveillance aircraft and ballistic missiles to the Gulf states. It was medium-range air-to-air missiles, not ballistic missiles. Venezuela's ousted President Nicolas